Hi, everyone, and welcome once again to one of our Hobby Memorial Library events. We are so excited today to have a professor from Collin County. Well, it's not Collin County anymore, it's called Collin
Collin College.
College.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's up in the Plano, Dallas area. We have with us Dr. Terry Furgerson. He is an adjunct professor there, and he is going to be telling us an amazing military history story. I know it's amazing because I got a chance to read his book before he even is going to tell you all about it. So I'm excited to hear what he has to say. Welcome, Dr. Ferguson. How are you?
Well, I'm fine, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So just tell me whenever you would like the PowerPoint to start.
Well, I guess we have a title slide.
Okay.
There we go. Just a quick little FYI. This is a advertisement that appeared in national news magazines in 1941. I think most notably Life magazine. So that's not particularly important. I just thought I'd let you know where that came from. But this was actually advertised. The opening of this plant was advertised, across the nation. It was a big deal. So I do have, before I get started, I have a slide at the beginning that shows aerial strength of the U.S. Air Force in 1938, which doesn't really fit anywhere into the narrative, but kind of sets the groundwork. So maybe we could look at that one real quick. There you
That
go.
one?
Yeah, this is in 1938, which is a year before the outbreak of war in Europe. This is the combat strength of U.S. Army Air Corps. Okay, so we can leave that up for a second. I don't address this in the presentation, but I thought it would be helpful if you kind of knew, what was the state of the Air Force prior to this enlargement, this mobilization. And you can see it's just, I mean, ridiculously small compared to what we think of when we think of World War II. I mean, the entire four-engine bomber strength of the United States Air Force, actually at the time was the United States Army Air Corps, was 12, 12 B-17 bombers. So when you picture the big formations of 1943, 1944, we could not have done that in 1938. So uh, so I've got a presentation here for you. I'll just, if you want to leave that up for a minute, I'll give you a slide here. I'll let you know when I need the slide changed. Okay. So I guess if you're ready, I am. So let's do it.
Oh, change?
No. I'm sorry. Go. You can leave that up for a minute, but
Okay.
I'll let you know when I need the slide changed.
Okay.
Uh, so I'll just kind of read this like a presentation. So during World War II, American industry produced a multitude and variety of weapons from factories across the United States. Some of these facilities are well known, notably the Ford Willow Run aircraft plant in Michigan or the Kaiser shipyards in California. I'm here to tell you about a plant located on the outskirts of Dallas, Texas. Operated by the North American Aviation Company, NAA, the factory is arguably the premier example of industrial mobilization for World War II. Yet the plant is largely forgotten today, and its contributions to war effort are overlooked. So how did Dallas, a city with no pre-existing aircraft manufacturing industry, become the location for an airplane factory? The answer begins with President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the year 1938 offers a starting point for discussion. In his State of the Union address on 3rd of January, Roosevelt referred to a world of high tension and disorder. He stated, "We must keep ourselves adequately strong in self-defense." On 28th January, the president made recommendations to Congress. Roosevelt wanted greater funding for the Navy, 2 new battleships, ammunition for the Army, an increase in anti-aircraft materials, and more than $6 million to manufacture industrial tooling. Nothing was explicitly stated regarding aviation at this time. The momentum for readiness accelerated after Germany annexed Austria in March of 1938. On 29th April, presidential advisor Bernard Baruch wrote a letter to Roosevelt. Next slide, please. Baruch had been the head of the War Industries Board during World War I. There we go, thank you. I didn't put the actual letter here because it's quite long, but this is just the cover sheet. Baruch called for the acquisition of machinery to produce gunpowder, the manufacture of artillery, semi-automatic infantry rifles, and then, quote, airplanes and more airplanes. White House files suggest an interest in military aviation during the middle of 1938, but air power was just one part of a readiness problem. An increased focus on aviation was brought about by the Czechoslovakian crisis in the autumn of 1938. After listening to a speech by Adolf Hitler on 12 September, Roosevelt ordered Harry L. Hopkins to go out to the Pacific coast and take a look at the aircraft industry with a view to its expansion for war production. At the end of September came the Munich Conference, which accelerated actions at the White House. William C. Bullitt, the United States ambassador to France, returned to Washington on 13 October and briefed Roosevelt. French officials believed that Hitler had been emboldened by his Air Force, backed by an industry capable of rapid expansion. According to historian Mark Watson, President Roosevelt became convinced for the first time that American airplane production should be greatly stimulated with all possible speed. The French believed the Germans possessed a superior air force, and they took steps accordingly. France ordered 100 Curtiss H-75 fighters on 13th May 1938, with an option to purchase more. But were concerns about the German aircraft industry well-founded? The French had legitimate fears. They were substantiated by representatives of the American aviation industry who had visited European aircraft factories. These men grasped the implications of what they saw in the German factories they visited. Next slide, please. Okay. One of these visitors was Lawrence Bell of Bell Aircraft, who toured Germany, Italy, France, and Great Britain during the summer of 1938. On 12 September, the same day as the previously mentioned speech by Hitler, Bell submitted a confidential report describing his observations and ranking the capabilities of each country's aviation industry. Bell rated Germany as a 10, England as a 5, Italy as a 2, and France merely at 1. Germany, he estimated, produced 8 to 10,000 planes per year in modern, efficient factories. Bell's report described the European aviation industry, but what about the United States? As previously mentioned, the president asked Harry Hopkins to investigate this in September. Hopkins apparently assigned the task to Major Alfred J. Lyon of the Army Air Corps, who responded with a memorandum on 3 November 1938. Next slide, please. Harry Hopkins headed the Works Progress Administration. So Lyon issued his report. Lyon listed 12 manufacturers of military aircraft with a large concentration in Southern California. Other manufacturers were based along the eastern seaboard. The industry was operating below capacity with an estimated 1,200 aircraft produced in 1938. Lyon calculated that existing facilities could produce 7,500 airplanes per year. To expand beyond that would require additional factories. But aviation companies would be hesitant to expend capital building facilities that might not be needed. If increased Army procurement proved to be short-term, the industry could find itself with expensive plants sitting idle. One possible answer was for the government to construct and operate aircraft factories. This would be a problem, as many aviation firms depended on military orders to survive. If the government built its own aircraft, it could harm the aviation industry, on which any major production program would depend. Plus, the government lacked experience in designing and manufacturing airplanes on a large scale. Around this time, Roosevelt established an aircraft committee to study the problem. On 28 October 1938, only 3 days after it was created, the group called for production capacity of 15,000 aircraft annually within 2 years. The committee also advocated the building of additional factories by the government, capable of manufacturing 16,000 planes per year. A follow-up letter on 2 November identified possible locations for plants, including the Dallas-Fort Worth area. In the weeks after the Munich conference, a variety of sources provided Roosevelt with information about military aviation. He called a meeting at the White House to discuss the situation. Held on 14th November, it was attended by Roosevelt, Hopkins, and members of the cabinet. Military officers were also present, including Army Chief of Staff Malin Craig, Deputy Chief George C. Marshall, and Henry H. Arnold of the Air Corps. Sources agree that Roosevelt controlled the conversation. Mark Watson relates that the president did most of the speaking, as if his mind had been made up by earlier discussion and appraisal. According to historian Irving B. Hawley Jr., Roosevelt did not ask for advice. He laid his positions on the line. Roosevelt wanted to dramatically increase the strength of the Air Corps. He desired an Army Air Force of 20,000 airplanes and an annual productive capacity of 24,000. There were political considerations, however. With a depression ongoing, with isolationist sentiments common among Americans, Roosevelt requested a less ambitious goal. He wanted a program for 10,000 planes over a 2-year period, of which 8,000 would come from existing plants and 2,000 from new plants built with government funds. FDR also desired the creation of an unused plant capacity for producing 10,000 airplanes a year. The program called for the government to build 7 aircraft factories, of which 2 would go into operation. The remaining would be held in reserve. There were many things to consider when selecting locations for these plants. New factories should be far inland to provide greater protection against attack. But there were other requirements. Factories needed plentiful and reliable electric service. Railroad access would be useful for bringing in materials. An airfield would be necessary to fly out finished aircraft, and moderate weather would assist in that regard. Finally, there had to be an available pool of workers to operate the factory. All of these requirements were satisfied by Dallas, Texas. As the calendar flipped into 1940, well, the war started September 1st, 1939. I seem to have left that out.
Important.
War breaks out September 1st, 1939, thus accelerating things. As the calendar flips into 1940, the war in Europe was static. But in the spring, Hitler seized the initiative. The Germans attacked France, rapidly gaining the upper hand. On 15th May, Winston Churchill received a call from his French counterpart, who lamented, "We have been defeated. We are beaten. We have lost the battle." The surprised Churchill promptly sent a communication to Roosevelt asking for American support to Great Britain. Churchill requested 40 or 50 of your older destroyers and several hundred of the latest types of aircraft. The success of the Germans was on Roosevelt's mind as he delivered an address to Congress on 16th May, 1940. He listed a number of military needs, but emphasized aircraft, calling for additional production capacity. He then requested previously unseen numbers. In November 1938, he had talked of 20,000 aircraft. Now Roosevelt wanted a program to provide 50,000 airplanes. Furthermore, he wanted an industrial capacity capable of producing 50,000 airplanes a year. Roosevelt wanted aircraft and aircraft factories. The question of what kinds of aircraft was unanswered. Also unknown was who would build them and where it would be done. In Texas, the members of the Dallas Chamber of Commerce were working to make their city part of the answer. Civic leaders had long been interested in bringing the aircraft industry to Dallas. In 1928, the city established an aviation plan after purchasing Love Field in 1927 for use as a municipal airport. The city also owned Hensley Field, which was leased to the United States Army. This airfield was visited by a congressional delegation on 13th November 1939 as part of a tour of Air Corps facilities. The visitors were greeted by leadership from the Dallas Chamber of Commerce. The businessmen presumably took the opportunity to advocate locating an aviation plant in Dallas. They probably found receptive ears, as Texas had friends in high places. United States Vice President John Nance Garner was a Texan, as was Sam Rayburn, the House Majority Leader. These efforts apparently brought fruit. The spring of 1940 brought visitors to Dallas from 2 aviation firms who were scouting locations for factories. On 18th June 1940, the directors of the Dallas Chamber of Commerce met to consider the situation. It had been just 4 weeks since Roosevelt had issued his call for 50,000 airplanes, and mere days since representatives of Consolidated Aircraft had discussed their needs with the city government and Chamber of Commerce. Ben Kritz, vice president of the chamber, believed that Consolidated was ready to come to Dallas if the city would meet the requirements. There were concerns the opportunity might be lost without quick, decisive action. In 2 days, the chamber formulated a plan by the necessary land. 18 Dallas businessmen committed themselves to bringing the factory to Dallas with or without cooperation from the city government. On July 5th, the Dallas Morning News featured a banner headline declaring $8 million plane factory employing 5,000 to be built here. It would be the largest single plant in Texas. The announcement was made in San Diego, California by Consolidated Aircraft and in Dallas by the Chamber of Commerce. But it turned out to be inaccurate news. The announced facility was never built due to decisions made by the federal government. For some time, federal officials had been contemplating how to finance expansion of the aviation industry. Now, with the president's call for 50,000 aircraft, the need to resolve this issue became paramount. Various concepts were explored, but the most important source of funding, and the one that eventually impacted Dallas, was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. There was a belief that the RFC could play a role in defense financing. Congress passed legislation allowing the RFC to lend money for defense efforts, with a measure being signed by Roosevelt on 25 June 1940. Having agreed to finance industrial expansion, the national government determined which facilities and companies received priority. With both Consolidated and North American Aviation eyeing Dallas, it was necessary to choose. It appeared Consolidated held the upper hand, but executives at North American wrote a series of letters to government officials to sway the decision in their favor, and North American was awarded the factory site. Next slide, please. Once again, the newspapers announced the building of an airplane factory in Dallas, but this time the reports were accurate. On 17th August, the Daily Times Herald featured a front-page headline declaring Dallas gets big plane factory. The next day, the Dallas Morning News broke the news to its Sunday readers, announcing the impending construction of a North American factory next to Hensett Field. At this time, the exact method of financing the plan had yet to be finalized. Eventually, costs were covered by the Defense Plant Corporation, which was created on 22nd August 1940 as a subsidiary of the RFC. The DPC made a preliminary decision on 21st October when a lease agreement was authorized with North American. Formal action occurred on 14th November during a meeting of the DPC directors held in Washington. The DPC would be the actual owner of the factory, with North American leasing the facility. The estimated startup cost was officially tabulated at $7,961,349. While the government sorted out details, construction was already underway. A groundbreaking ceremony was held on 28th September. Okay? A general contractor was announced on 1st November, with work scheduled to begin within 2 weeks. The construction team struggled against torrential rains in November, creating what one reporter termed a mudkrieg. Despite this, work progressed. Concrete was poured in November, and upright steel started being put into place on 2nd December. By the end of the year 1940, approximately 50% of the steelwork had been completed on the main building as the factory started to rise from what had been cotton fields. Construction was finished ahead of schedule, and it was the first emergency plant to begin operation. Next slide, please. This is a picture of a plant as finished. The building of a plant was a significant event for the city. The major Dallas newspapers featured special sections on Sunday, 6 April 1941, with articles about North American, the factory, and the AT-6 trainer aircraft to be built there. Entire pages of advertisements welcomed the new business. To celebrate the occasion, North American held an open house for the public that day. Planners anticipated 25,000 people might attend the scheduled 4-hour event. Instead, there were that many on hand when the gates opened at 2 p.m. When the gates finally closed at 7 o'clock, an estimated 60,000 people had toured the factory. Others listened at home to a live broadcast on local radio station KGKO. No one knew that the attack on Pearl Harbor was only 35 weeks away. Official dedication ceremonies took place the next day. Key executives from North American were present, including Chairman of the Board Ernest R. Breach and Company President James Dutch Kindleberger. The Air Corps sent Major General George H. Brett, and William S. Knudsen represented the Office of Production Management. Texas Governor W. Lee O'Daniel served as the official host for the occasion. Among the guests were Dallas Mayor Woodall Rogers and Amon G. Carter of Fort Worth. The dignitaries gathered inside the plant for a luncheon, then adjourned to the nearby aircraft hangar where speeches would be given. Ernest Breach served as the master of ceremonies, with Governor O'Daniel giving the opening remarks. Kindleberger, Brett, and Knudsen also spoke. Parts of the ceremony went out across the mutual broadcasting system, providing coverage of the event from coast to coast. The opening of the plant was a national story. Next slide, please. After the speeches concluded, the proceedings moved to the flight ramp, where Brett accepted delivery of the first 3 Dallas-built AT-6 trainers. Army pilots manned the aircraft and took off from Hensley Field, returning to circle over the crowd. It had been 192 days since the groundbreaking ceremony, and the Texas Division of North American had delivered its first aircraft. It was just the beginning. On 24th July, the North American Board of Directors met in Dallas. They toured the plant and inspected the 100th aircraft produced there. This averages out to about 25 planes a month. And Dutch Kindleberger reported that production was 2.5 months ahead of schedule. Plans called for 12,000 employees building 400 trainers a month, and the plan had orders totaling $108 million. Conditions in Dallas were apparently satisfactory, but a major development came about 3 weeks later. On 15th August, the North American plant in Inglewood, California, delivered its last AT-6, and the Dallas factory took full responsibility for producing the aircraft for the United States military. In less than a year, the North American plant had gone from being approved through construction and into production. Now, after 4 months of operation, the factory was the sole source for the essential AT-6 trainer. On the first day of September, the plant reached another milestone, completing the first aircraft assembled totally out of parts fabricated in-house. Initial planes had utilized components supplied by Inglewood, but from September forward, the Dallas factory was self-sufficient. Next picture, please. It's a hangar full of T-6 trainers. Sunday, 23rd November, brought another achievement. In what was the largest single delivery to date in Dallas, 50 trainers were turned over to the military. And I'm pretty certain this photo was taken the night before. It was 1 year since the first structural steel had arrived at the plant site, and less than 8 months since the first trainers had been delivered. The Texas Division of North American remained consistently and considerably ahead of contract schedule. But time was running out. 2 weeks later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and on 8th December, President Roosevelt spoke to Congress and the nation. In Dallas, North American workers gathered around radios to listen. The atmosphere was subdued, with one observer writing, "Faces simply became a trifle grimmer, more set in determined lines." Some employees had personal stakes in the news from the Pacific. Cora Moore had a brother-in-law stationed at Hickam Field in Honolulu. Doris Sandlin had relatives in the Philippines near Manila in what was now a war zone. One unnamed employee simply said, "Now we know what we've got to do." By the time the day shift went home, the United States was officially at war with Japan. The next day, the Dallas Morning News approached local defense industries to inquire about their status. A diesel engine factory in Garland was still under construction, but it was hoped that production could begin in February. Managers at the Seven Aircraft Company anticipated going to a 24/7 schedule with plans to double the workforce. Officials at North American, however, offered no grand statement or details regarding specific plans. Their answer was short and to the point. We're going to build more airplanes. Next slide, please. All right. So that's the building and beginning operation of the plant. What happens after Pearl Harbor? Well, the entry of the United States into the war brought changes to the Dallas operations of North American as America moved into a full war footing. These changes came quickly. On 13th January, the Air Corps issued a letter of intent to North American stating the War Department planned on ordering 750 four-engine B-24 bombers from the company. Dutch Kindleberger signed the letter on 15th January, putting North America on the path to producing heavy bombers. Next slide, please. The plane in the back with four engines, that's a B-24. The plane on the right front is one of the T-6 trainers. The third plane on the left is a P-51 Mustang, which we'll talk about shortly. What the letter of intent did not specify is where the bombers would be built. The B-24 Liberator was a larger aircraft than anything North American was then producing, with a wingspan of 110 feet, as you can see here in this photo. Okay. While the existing factory buildings might have been able to accommodate the B-24, manufacturing processes were set up around the current models. A massive rearrangement of assembly lines would be required, disrupting production during a critical period. The best solution to the problem was to construct a new factory to produce the B-24. A new plant could be built alongside an existing one, where the infrastructure was already in place. This would also allow the existing factory to support the new one during the startup process. The decision was almost certainly made before Kindleberger signed the letter of intent on 15th January. This is indicated by a War Department message dated 19th January, which referenced a proposal from North American concerning an expansion of the Dallas plant. The teletype stated North American planned to increase its manufacturing capacity in Dallas from 300 trainers a month to 400. More significantly, the company sought to attain additional capacity for the manufacture of 75 B-24 airplanes per month. The estimated cost for the expansion project was $22,198,500. An additional 25,000 employees would be needed to handle the workload. Dallas thus received the assignment to build B-24 bombers in what was essentially a complete second factory located only a few hundred feet to the west of the existing unit. This new facility was designated as the B plant, with the older operation becoming the A plant. Slide, please. So, the B plant would build the bombers, and the A plant was where the trainers were built. Okay. Once construction was authorized, it was anticipated that the facility would be ready in approximately 200 days, with production beginning 15 days later. Delivery of the B-24 bombers could begin in early 1943, with peak production reached 580 days after approval of the project. Unlike the previous construction project, this time there was no apparent media coverage. The construction of B plant appears to have been the subject of a news blackout. There is no indication of a grand public dedication ceremony, an open house, any of the celebratory occasions associated with the initial arrival of North American to Dallas. This might have been partly due to the pressing needs of the war effort, but the main reason was probably concern about security. Obviously, it was impossible to hide the building of a 1,200-foot by 600-foot structure from the thousands of employees who worked mere yards from the job site, nor from the nearby residents of Grand Prairie. But publicity about the plant was withheld from print sources that might have spread the news to areas outside the immediate vicinity, and details about the factory were presumably on a need-to-know basis. It was the closing days of 1942 before any information was released to the public. As far as production of the B-24 went, Dallas reached a milestone when the first completed bomber rolled out for its maiden flight on 16th March 1943. This was 319 days since the production contract was signed. The olive-drab aircraft featured the phrase, "more to come," painted on the side of its nose. With the first plane completed, it was publicly announced that the B plant was engaged in B-24 production. Up to that point, the exact model of bomber had been unreleased, but with the large plane outside the hangar and taking off from Hensley Field, it would have been difficult to keep it under wraps. And so Dallas openly joined in the production of the Liberator. The problem, there was no rush of Liberators rolling out of the door of the plant. The first ship promised more to come, but the reality was that the plant was not ready to enter full-scale production. There had been a series of delays, beginning with the failure of structural materials to arrive as scheduled. Equipment also arrived late, including hydraulic presses and machine shop fixtures. Contractors had difficulty hiring enough labor, and there was a shortage of electrical power in the plant until additional transformers arrived. All these factors caused the B plan to be completed about 4 months later than scheduled. In the meantime, the first B-24 had been largely built in sub-assemblies in the hangar building of the A plant. While 1942 saw the building of the B plant, the coming of war also affected the A plant. North American had designed a new fighter aircraft known as the P-51 Mustang, seen here in this slide, and the Army wanted large numbers. North America needed to increase its production capacity for the aircraft. At the time, the Mustang was only built in Inglewood, California, and the desirability of a second source was obvious. According to North American records, the decision to manufacture the planes in Dallas was made in October 1942. Since the Texas facility was engaged in more production and owned by the federal government, official authorization was needed. On 14 December 1942, a government teletype outlined the proposal to initiate P-51 production in the Dallas A plant. The usual parameters were taken into consideration, including the availability of labor, transportation, and utilities, all of which were considered adequate. There was concern over the availability of housing, which was deemed insufficient for the increased workforce, and it was stated that several hundred additional housing units will be required. August 1943 was the third anniversary of the public announcement that North American was coming to Dallas. The Chamber of Commerce celebrated the anniversary with a luncheon on 24th August 1943 with North American executives in attendance. North American President Dutch Kindleberger spoke to the crowd. He praised the P-51 Mustang, which he called the world's best fighter plane at any altitude. The first Dallas-built versions, designated the P-51C, were preparing to roll off the assembly lines at this time, some 3 months later than forecast. The B-24 bomber was also behind schedule, but the kinks were being worked out in the process, and large numbers of both airplanes were scheduled for production. Kindleberger informed his audience that an additional 19,000 workers would be needed by the 1st of January 1944. Furthermore, to retain that number, the company needed to hire 24,000 men to offset the turnover. These new workers would need accommodations, and there were concerns about inadequate housing in the area. These labor demands and an ongoing housing shortage strained the ability of the community to furnish the requested manpower, and this resulted in Dallas being declared a Group 1 critical labor area, effective 1st of October 1943. This triggered a flurry of activity as businesses and politicians sought ways to address the situation. The declaration of Dallas as a critical labor area, along with the lagging deliveries of P-51s and B-24s, brought attention from the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program, usually known as the Truman Committee, after its chairman, Harry S. Truman. Members of the committee, not including Truman, members of the committee arrived on 9th October to explore the ongoing problems in Dallas. What resulted was 4 days of often contentious hearings during which North American workers expressed discontent and made accusations of weak management at North American. Company executives in turn offered explanations centered on design changes, supply shortages, and employee turnover. Government inefficiency was criticized as well, especially the failure to provide sufficient housing. There was plenty of blame to go around, but the basic common element was that the factory had expanded way beyond the original plan at an accelerated pace dictated by wartime pressure. Adjustments were made accordingly, with production schedules reduced and management increased. Other organizational changes were also made to improve efficiency at the plant and reduce the requirements for manpower. As 1944 dawned, the North American plant was emerging from the chaos of expansion, and three different models of aircraft were under production: the AT-6 trainer, the P-51 fighter, and the B-24 bomber, and they were all rolling off the assembly lines. In the first 5 months of 1944, the factory delivered more than 2,400 aircraft, with 646 in the month of May alone, a new record for the Texas operation. Production reached another new peak in July 1944, and in August, 653 new planes flew out of Hensley Field for delivery. This brought deliveries to 4,370 aircraft in the first 8 months of the year, and the company proudly announced that the Texas division of North American had produced 1 out of every 15 airplanes built in the nation that year. But even as the plant was reaching new heights, a changing war situation pointed towards a reduced emphasis on the production of the B-24. The successful invasion of France in June 1944 suggested the war against Germany was entering a new stage. An American air superiority lessened the number of bombers lost in combat. Meanwhile, in the Pacific theater, the long-range B-29 bomber had emerged as the weapon of choice in the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. B-24s were still needed, but with 5 different plants producing the airplane, there was an excess of production capacity. As a result, North American schedule was reduced by hundreds of aircraft, with a halt to the program in October 1944, when the last B-24 rolled out of the B plant. Production of the AT-6 trainer and the P-51 fighter continued into 1945 at the A plant. Meanwhile, the B plant went into pre-production on a new cargo ship known as the C-82 Packet. It appeared the North American factory would be busy until at least 1946, but events once again altered the situation. On 6 August 1945, a B-29 Superfortress dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, followed 3 days later by a second nuclear bombing against the city of Nagasaki. On 14 August, Japan notified the Allied powers of its desire to surrender. The news was announced by President Harry S. Truman at 6 p.m. Dallas time, and a festive air filled the city. Night shift workers at North American heard the news, cheered, sang the national anthem, and went home. The employees were given 15th August off as a holiday. As it happened, the majority would never return to work at the plant. On 15th August 1945, the company announced that the government had terminated all aircraft contracts for Dallas. Workers were told not to come to work on 16th August, except for those working in administrative departments charged with processing payroll and activities related to the shutdown. Approximately 15,000 people had lost their jobs, either immediately or in the near future. The narrative had come full circle. The news that North American was coming to Dallas had been officially announced on 17th August 1940. The notification of the plant shutdown occurred on 15th August, just 2 days short of 5 years later. What Dutch Kindleberger referred to as the Dallas story had effectively ended. Left behind were 2 eerily quiet manufacturing facilities, thousands of people trained in industrial skills, and a production legacy calculated at 18,784 aircraft. This number represented the greatest output achieved by a single United States plant during the war years, and was achieved by personnel who were typically inexperienced in such work prior to the conflict. The successful transition from planes to planes was a substantial accomplishment. But the North American plant was more than just a Dallas story. It was a national one as well. As the first factory constructed and financed by the Defense Plant Corporation, it represents a working partnership between the national government and private enterprise. The cooperation facilitated the pre-war enlargement of the American aviation industry into a manufacturing juggernaut that produced 295,959 aircraft during the period from July of 1940 through August of 1945. North American Dallas played a significant role in this accomplishment. In the end, any historical evaluation of the Dallas plant must recognize these facts. The factory was the first of emergency expansion facilities financed by the United States government, making it the prototype example of such a facility. It produced more aircraft than any other wartime factory, and it played a significant role in transforming the city of Dallas into an industrial center. Considering these facts together, it becomes clear that the story of North American and Dallas is more than just a matter of state or local history. It is arguably the premier example of industrial mobilization for the famed arsenal of democracy, and as such, it's a story worthy of remembrance. I should have a slide for production totals. Oh, got this one. Here, you go and go back to that one. That's, no, forward. I'm sorry, P50, next forward. This is all three aircraft on the flight ramp together. There's the P-51, the B-24, and the T-6 trainer in the background. Okay, next slide should be production totals. Here we go. So North American Aviation produced more aircraft during World War II than any other aviation industry manufacturer. Now, if you rate it by airframes, a couple of other manufacturers produced more weight because they were building B-17 and B-24 and B-29 bombers. So if you rank the manufacturers by airframe weight, North American, I think, is third or fourth. If you do it by units built, North American is the largest. And then you'll see that of the three North American plants, that Dallas is the largest of the three plants with, as I said, 18,784 aircraft. Okay. This is just as a side, this chart is actually from the U.S. Army official history, and there's a typo in the chart. It says 299 E6, and that should say F6, which is the photo reconnaissance version of the P-51. So yes, even government documents can have errors in them. So I have one more slide. It's takeaway of all this, which I've already stated, but here it is in writing for the students maybe watching. Dallas was the first expansion plant to go into operation, achieving sustained production prior to Pearl Harbor. Ranked in terms of airframes produced, North American was the most prolific manufacturer in the United States, with the Dallas operation having the largest total of the three plants, the three NAA plants. And finally, as a cooperative venture between the government and the aviation industry, North American Aviation in Dallas provides a case study for how the United States mobilized industry for war. Okay? And there's one last slide. It's the all-important plug. This is all available in a book. It's available for the University of North Texas Press or the usual online book retailers, and I think we all know who that is. Okay? All right. And there's a flag here that says there are some questions.
Yes. So let's see what your questions are.
All right. I will try to provide answers. Virtual librarian. And I'll go ahead and read. Can other people see these, or should I read them out loud?
No, you got to read them.
Okay. And it disappeared. Can we bring the question back?
Oh, do you think it made a difference which company got Dallas?
Okay, I'll tell you why North American won out over Consolidated. Okay. They were building trainers. Okay. Consolidated was building seaplanes, and they had a new prototype airplane, the B-24 Liberator. Okay. Which of course eventually was built in the B plant. But at the time the decision was made, the B-24 was a new aircraft and was still being, was not mature. Okay. If Roosevelt wants to expand the Army Air Corps, later becomes the Army Air Force, to 50,000 airplanes, what's the first thing you're going to need? Pilots. Okay. So the decision was made to give it to North American because they were building the trainers, so you needed the trainers to train the pilots to build the later fighters. Now, another reason for this is trainers do not become obsolete as quickly. Due to the war in Europe, we were learning a lot about what combat required of fighters and bombers. So fighters were rapidly evolving, whereas trainers were a more stagnant design. Okay, if you build thousands of trainers, they're not going to become obsolete quickly. Fighters or bombers would have been. So North American got the gig because they were building the trainers that we needed to expand the pilot cadre.
Cool. Cool. Thank you. Another question.
So,
If Dallas had everything it needed to have needs met of the workers and factories, do you think that Dallas's factories could have quickly produced the required planes before the deadline? I could answer that. I read your book.
well, thank you. The problem was, okay, so they got behind for a couple of reasons. There was supply chain issues. I mean, the entire aviation industry has exploded. Okay, and so there's only so many people making certain parts. Okay,
Tires.
Tires, yeah, okay, tires would be done by a subcontractor. Of course, rubber is hard to get. Okay, one of the problems was in order to produce the planes quickly, they had to break the processes down. Okay. So in a peacetime environment, you might have X number of trained aviation engineers who can move from job to job and build the airplanes. But when you start mass producing in large numbers, to get it done, what you do is you have a larger pool of employees, but they're only trained to do like one thing. Your job is to put, the generator on the motor. All right. So if the generators are not arrived, you're just kind of standing around waiting. Okay. And this was one of the things that caused the Truman investigation was accusations of wasted manpower. There's guys just standing around not doing anything. Okay. Well, part of the problem is maybe the parts they need haven't arrived yet. The other problem is due to the delay in getting parts, North American has to train people. Okay. So you can't wait till all the parts arrive and then start training the assembly crews, okay? Because there's going to be another delay. So you start training the assembly crews, and when the parts don't arrive, you basically park them in the plant, and they're doing make work, they're polishing equipment or sweeping trash or something. So it looks like there's a great manpower wastage in the plant, which is part of what triggered the thing. So yeah, I mean, if the people were there once the B-24 started rolling off the assembly line, they built 966 B-24s in total, practically all of which were built between November of 43 and November of 44. So in 1 year, they built most of the 966 B-24s. That was the other problem. There was design changes to the B-24. The Army decided they wanted a power-operated gun turret in the nose. And of course, that means having to redesign the front of the airplane. So, and that means throwing away tools and fittings. And so a lot of people probably going, I can't believe we're throwing all this stuff away, but it's now obsolete. Okay. So if you're in the factory and you only can see your little sphere of like 20 feet each direction, you don't necessarily see the big picture. So I mean, once the plant got into production, they were cranking out airplanes like nobody's business. But there's a learning curve, and this was part of the problems Kindleberger, when he was testifying to a Truman Committee, had to deal with. I think the politicians are looking at it as we've signed a contract for X number of dollars for X number of airplanes. So in their mind, they're probably dividing the number of dollars into the number of airplanes. And hey, if we've spent half of the money, we should have half the airplanes. And it doesn't work that way. You spend like 80% of the money before the first airplane rolls off the assembly line. But you have to explain that to people, and they don't understand. Well, we spent hundreds of millions of dollars worth of airplanes. We're almost there. Okay.
Yeah.
So hopefully that answered the question.
Well, and also the things that you didn't even touch upon, they didn't have enough roads for the workers to get to the factory, enough houses for them to live in the factory, and then, an occasional strike and union problem and president needing to get involved and saying, I'm gonna put the troops in there if there's anybody. Yeah, they had a few problems along the way, huh?
Yeah, there was no strikes in Dallas, but there was a strike in Inglewood prior to
Yes,
Pearl Harbor. And once Pearl Harbor comes, it's like you don't strike. You don't
right.
strike war. But there were labor difficulties. But yes, housing was a big one. And of course, it's wartime. Everything is in shortages. Okay, so these people, remember, we got gasoline is rationed and tires are rationed. Okay, and the speed limit's 35 miles an hour. Okay, because everyone's driving around on bald, unsafe tires. All right. So you can only people have to live within a certain distance of a plant. If there's inadequate housing, you've got a labor shortage, and that's part of what triggered the investigation. North Americans saying we need 38,000 people, and Dallas is going, we don't have them. Okay, and and they can't commute in from 100 miles out. No one's got gas or tires, so
It was a
it was a
big
lot
mess.
complicated. It's a very complicated puzzle. Uh,
Yeah,
it's a lot of pieces to it. Okay?
yeah. It's really interesting how all the different aspects. So we have another question.
Do we have
Do
any
we?
knowledge of how all these jobs ended affecting the area?
Okay.
Uh, so as I said, a lot of people working with the assembly line weren't highly trained machinists. Now, at the beginning, maybe they were when they had a smaller crew. They were hiring and training machinists. Okay. Uh, by the end, you maybe you're not as much of the machinist. You like assembly stuff, but still, thousands of people came out of this having acquired knowledge on how to work in a factory. So, I mean, there was practically no industry in Dallas prior to 1940. The biggest factory was a Ford assembly plant. Okay. Uh, so Dutch Kindleberger estimated, I don't have the number in front of me, but over the 5 years, but about 75,000 people went through the plant as workers. Okay. So even if only, let's say, a tenth of them became highly skilled in the process, there's 7,500 people who have industrial skills. So what happens is after the end of the war, when the plant is closed, one of the North American managers, Robert McCullough, if I recall was his name, uh, he started a company called the Texas Engineering and Manufacturing Company. Okay. And he formed his company specifically to take advantage of a trained workforce that was in the area who knew how to do sheet metal work and stuff. So he's like, man, there's people who know how to do this work, and so he started this company to do things like that. And they ended up being doing a lot of subcontracting for like refurbishing airplanes. They also made popcorn poppers, curiously enough. Uh, and so the Texas Engineering and Manufacturing Company is usually abbreviated TEMCO. Okay. And if you've lived in Dallas for a while,
Yes.
you might
Yeah.
remember Ling Temco Vought. That's the Temco is eventually absorbed into LTV, which people in Dallas might remember. Oh, LTV. Okay. So yeah, this trained cadre of workers, helped industrialize Dallas after the war. Those were three very good questions. That was all the questions we had. I'm sad.
Yeah. Well, no, I have one question that you still haven't answered.
Okay.
Well, the government jumped into this and said, we need a factory. We need you guys to create all of this. Was this the first time? Because I mean, when we had COVID, they jumped in and said, we need this, manufacture that. And so I was wondering, was this the first time that the government just jumped in and said, all right, private sector, we need to get this going for our country?
I would anticipate, I'm going to make an educated guess, that
Okay.
similar things probably happened in World War One, but I won't be able to honestly answer your question. So rather than make up an answer, I will
Okay.
just tell you I'm not sure. I bet if I looked at World War One, there's probably a similar instance. But certainly I can't think of anything after World War One that would have been like this. And yes, you asked about the COVID. There is the defense man, I forget what it's called, but there is a law now where you can like basically tell people we need you to build this. And I've never studied that law. A lot of times, what they do is there's like some federal funding that comes in, but then it comes with strings attached. Like, yeah, if there's an emergency, we may ask you to do something for us. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was a big ask.
Yeah.
That was a big ask, and
I'm
they
sorry.
did it.
I'm sorry it was such a lame response.
No, it wasn't. I wasn't. I was just very impressed that, Roosevelt said, "Hey guys, we need to get this started," and he did it before the fact. And that was a really great insight. I know he had people telling him we need to do it, but the fact that they could get it done is a little scary that these guys were up in planes that they just, grabbed people and said, build a plane. But it worked.
Yeah.
And they got them all trained, which was an amazing story. And
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, and talking about story, your book, I read his book, and it was just it was easy read. It was very fascinating, very detailed about um how this whole thing went. I mean, I learned everything there was to know about just the beginnings of the Grand Prairie area because their population just exploded over there.
Yes, it did.
Mm.
Uh, you mentioned putting together people to put planes. They now North American had been building the trainers for a couple of years, so they had plenty of working the bugs out. But still, to build a new plan and hire a bunch of Texans, and some supervisors come in who know how it's done. They opened a training facility so before the plant opened, and so by the time the plant opened, they already had like a cadre, like a nucleus of about 1,000 people who kind of knew what to do, and so that got them started. But that definitely was part of the problem. Was after Pearl Harbor, when the production schedules are ramped up and the numbers are increased, you know, they have to start hiring all these people, and that's when I have to start simplifying the jobs. Okay, your job is to do this.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that was part of the problem. If war had broken out, they probably would have stayed at 12, 15,000 people and just kept cranking out airplanes at a lower rate.
Right. Right. Well, thank you so much. We truly, truly appreciate you taking the time to share with us this military history story.
Well,
You guys, y'all don't get these kinds of stories in your history book. And
now,
so it's really cool that, we get a detailed version of something that went on here in our own state. And I mean, without that Dallas factory, we would not have been able to do what we did during World War II. So thank you so much. And before we go, guys, I just want to remind you our last military history series event will take place this Monday. We pre-recorded many of our area military veterans. We have a gentleman who was a POW in the Korean War. We have a Navy medic. We have a soldier who was in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we're going to be listening to some really awesome stories from them. These are all pre-recorded. So we're going to start uploading them at 11 o'clock on both our Facebook and Hobby Memorial Library's YouTube channel. So we hope that you will go ahead and check in with those stories. These are people in our community. And, to know the details of stories like this is what military history is. This is what history is. Yes, we've got stuff in the books, but listening to people tell their stories and have details like the Dallas story. That's what really is what we need to learn. So thank you guys. I hope you guys went and enjoyed the beautiful day. And thank you again, Dr. Furgerson. We truly appreciate the time, and we will be sharing this with CTC. And you guys, if y'all have any more questions, make sure you put them in the comments and we will forward them to Dr. Ferguson, because I'm sure he would love to answer questions, huh? That was his blood, sweat, and tears writing that book. So
yep,
yay.
10 years of
Yeah.
my life.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. All righty. Well,
Had a good time.
Yeah. All right, guys. So we will see you next time. And don't forget to check in with us on next Monday. Thank you again. And Alyssa, if you will take us out, please.